need to deal with right away. And with that, Art, you're on.
Okay, I'll get us done on time. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just go to the next slide. So my thing is all about what is oil and gas. And I'm still seeing the same first slide.
Uh-oh. One moment, please.
He can't hear us.
Oh, I can hear the one moment, please. I just can't move the slides.
We're having a problem with the clicker, and I can't.
Okay, that works. All right. Okay, so we have to drive manually?
I'm driving manually.
All right, Art, go.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about oil and gas and how this all relates. And so I want to talk about what is oil and gas, because a lot of people look at oil and gas as a single monolithic thing. And it's a huge industry. It has many different players, many different aspects. So this is not a single entity. Next slide. And we have many ways of slicing and dicing this industry, and so these are terms you're going to hear all the time, and they're going to be important when we interface with oil and gas companies. Are we talking an upstream operation? Upstream is where we do the exploration. We actually go find the energy in the ground, so to speak. Downstream, once I find it in the ground and I get it out of the ground, I got to put it in somebody's gas tank. Well, to do that, I need refiners, I need retailers, customers. To connect upstream to downstream, I have pipelines. We also have marine segments because a lot of this is moved over the water. And then we have a third area called service and, or another major area. It's outside oil and gas, but it isn't. It's called service and supply. There are a lot of companies that exist solely to support oil and gas. So when you have an oil well, say the Macondo well sitting in the Gulf of Mexico that made news, how many companies are on that platform? Tons of companies, and some of them with literally billions of dollars at risk. So it's not just one company. You've got a service company that's handling not just the maintenance, but how to make certain that the right mud, the right things are being put in. You've got another company that's responsible because they actually own the lease. You got another company that their specialty is actually drilling into the ground to get the oil for the lease. And so a lot of this stuff is done through cooperative ventures, and so you'll see a lot of time where two major oil companies will go together on a cooperative venture in a foreign country to develop something, and then they hire in all these other people. Next slide, please. So we can look at this in a couple different ways, and one way that people talk about is something called supermajors. And this list of companies right here, what most people refer to as the super major companies in the oil and gas space, these guys have billions of dollars in annual revenue. And yet, look at this bottom part. 90% of the oil is not controlled by them. It is controlled by OPEC cartel or state-owned nationals. And so the super majors will bid and get rights to pull the oil out of somebody else's possession. And so oil that's sitting in Azerbaijan or Nigeria or Venezuela, it's typically owned by the state in the country that it's sitting in. And then they sell the rights to supermajors to come, in essence, harvest this. Next slide. Now, one of the things that I skipped when I looked at upstream, downstream, we've gotten this whole area called midstream now. And it's realistically, if I break it upstream, downstream, midstream firms are part of what I would call downstream activity, but they're specialized. These are companies that do things like gathering. They connect wells to processing. So I have wells all over, say, the Gulf of Mexico. There are 160 oil platforms out, or gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico pumping gas out of the ground. Under the water, somebody has to take that gas and get it into a refinery somewhere or into a liquefaction facilities. Well, that's gathering. Once they get it someplace, I need to do something with it because what comes out of the ground is not what we use. So the processing, refining, especially if it goes into specialized products, is again a midstream operation. Transportation, this stuff just doesn't show up where I want it. It requires a lot of work and effort to move the liquid or the gases. And then storage. when it shows up where I want to use it, I need a reasonable amount of on-site storage, and so these companies build storage. If you come visit Houston sometime, when you fly into the airport, especially if you fly into Hobby because it's on the south side of town, it's worth looking out your window. One, you'll see billions of dollars worth of refineries. Two, you're going to see tanks all over the place because storing all this stuff really does matter. The other aspect of midstream firms is something that fits more in line with these service firms. These are specialty service companies. They do things like manage flow control. If I've got liquid flowing through a pipe, the viscosity, the temperature, the pressure, these things all get in the way of getting the job done, unfortunately. So unlike electricity, where I just apply a little more voltage and it shoves it to the other end, here I have to pump it with mechanical energy, and so they'll do things to add chemicals that make it so it takes less energy to deliver. I also have to deal with leak detection, because tiny leaks tend to become big problems in the oil and gas space. And so I know there are a lot of people out there that want to argue the oil and gas industry is environmentally unsafe, we should never do it. I'm going to speak up and say one thing right now. It's really simple. If an oil and gas firm loses control over any of their materials, they can't sell them. Hence, they're environmentally really, really stringent, not just because they want to protect the environment, but if I spill it into Kansas, I can't sell it in Texas. And so our air pollution in Houston, where we have all these refineries across all the way to New Orleans, it's actually really good. Our air quality is great. Why? If they let this stuff into the air, they can't sell it. And so they've gotten very, very good at managing this stuff. And midstream firms have had a big role to play in that. Next slide. So let's talk about what some of these firms are, because I had the Supermajors. These are the ideas of the types of firms you're going to see. Companies like Enbridge, which is a pure pipeline play pretty much, or Kinder Morgan. Then you've got natural gas companies like, for instance, ONEOK, which is actually used to be Oklahoma Natural Gas. You've got energy, Genesis Energy. They primarily do storage, although they also have to move it. They're just not a parking lot for oil and gas. A lot of these companies started in one area. Williams started with pipelines, then they moved into processing and transportation. Typically, companies in the mid-range firm either focus on a gas product or an oil product or some piece of it. There are very few that are large-scale plays. The exception to that is enterprise products. They do pipeline storage, they even do drilling and production, and when they buy a refinery, and it's just a matter of time till they do that, then they'll be in refining too. They have built their business by buying different companies though, so it's not a pure, one area of expertise. Next slide. So what makes all this stuff flow? It's money. But it's kind of an interesting flow of money. First of all, the price of oil is not set by the oil companies, the people pulling it out of the ground, the people that own the ground. It is set by markets. And these markets set it with the price of using the dollar, the U.S. dollar. So U.S. currency and how our government values or devalues currency. So if we have a strong dollar, that affects the price of oil. We have a weak dollar, that affects the price of oil. And so you have many, many different factors. You've got people out there speculating, you've got demand, you've got supply, and then you have literally OPEC can decide to turn the faucet on, turn the faucet off to their lands. So it's created a ton of boom and bust cycles. The 1980s, there was a bust cycle. It was devastating to the energy markets worldwide. The firms learned from this and changed. So let's look at the current bust cycle. Right now, we are definitely in an energy bust cycle in oil and gas. The price of oil has fallen to very low rates, but not historic low. A 60% price drop, but they've only done a 30% employment drop. The rationale behind that, they expect the price to go back up, and it is too hard to get people back and restart. They've had problems in the 80s getting the oil patch back up and running. The other factor is they've done a lot of consolidation and changing of operations. When I describe upstream, downstream, midstream, these companies all have learned from the past. No one is a pure play dependent on the price of oil. Next slide. Oh, I'll get to the economics, the dollar economics in a minute. One of the things about this, a lot of people don't understand size. Size matters. We have, for instance, 200,000 miles of oil pipelines within the U.S. Half of our domestic refining comes from only 3 places, and California is a tiny part of that half. The numbers and everything we do are big. That is a real picture of a steel structure being towed out of the Houston Ship Channel. You can see the size of the large hotel in the lower left-hand part of the picture. So everything that's done in oil and gas is, just by the nature of the beast, much bigger. When Hurricane Ike came through, they had to shut down several refineries in the Gulf Coast area around Houston. They did maintenance work afterwards. The maintenance packages they were offering that they had set up ready to go were in the $1 billion, and they executed those in months. So when you spend $5 billion on maintenance and you do it in 3 months, you know, you can imagine the burn rate. You can imagine how much is set up. Things cost more, you know. So when people start saying, whoa, this stuff's too expensive or they make too much money, you got to realize that everything has extra zeros just because of size. Next slide. This is what I wanted to talk about on how profits and how the money really flows. This slide and next slide will show this in the effects from the 1980s. So this is using ExxonMobil, fairly current data from last year. They generated $259 billion in revenue. Notice it's mostly downstream. Their money, their revenue comes from downstream. But look where the profit came from. Okay? It's somewhat split. The big change, though, is not just upstream-downstream ratios, but the addition of this chemical plant aspect. So no matter where the price of oil goes for ExxonMobil, even if it goes down to, say, 25, and OPEC says, we're going to send it to 25 because we want to crush the U.S. oil industry, it will stop us from pulling oil out of the ground in the Dakotas. It'll stop us from pulling oil out of the ground in Texas. It'll stop us from pulling oil out of the ground in a lot of places. However, using storage and other sources and reshifting my operations to like chemical production and things, I'm still going to make money. 2015 was a bad year for the oil industry. Note, they lost $2 billion from corporate and financing, i.e., you know, oh, we bet bad on that. We didn't have the money to cover that. They had to spend $2 billion there that they weren't counting on because of economic conditions. But yet they still generated pretty decent profit margins. Next slide. This one shows 2 different periods of time, or a couple of different periods of time. On the left-hand side, where you see that big green bar in the middle, that's where revenue comes from. Revenue almost always comes from downstream because that's where you sell the stuff. That's where you've added value to it. That's where your revenue's coming in. But your profits, let's go look at the profits on the other side. In 2011, which has a fairly good-sized blue bar, my profit came actually from upstream, pulling oil out of the ground. When the price of oil, that's when the price of oil is at 100. When the price of oil drops to 40, I can't make profit pulling it out of the ground. So notice my profit there was cut in half. But here's something that's really, really important to go notice. Overall, I still made money. Okay? One of the things that came out of the 80s was the understanding that I couldn't just rely upon the price of oil to make money in this market. I have to be nimble enough to move things around. Next slide. One of the realities of living in the oil field is regulation. Now I'm just going to pick a refinery, although there's a lot more to oil and gas, pipelines, etc. But in a refinery, I have to deal with EPA regulations. I have to deal with state environmental quality regulations. I have to deal with chemical facility anti-terrorism standards. That comes from DHS. I have pipeline issues because even when I move stuff around in pipelines on my own property, there's a lot of pipes and moving stuff. I have transportation of hazardous materials. Virtually every aspect of an oil and gas company is regulated by someone somewhere. Even price regulations in some points about what I can do and what I can't do on pricing. And so they live in a regulatory morass, which most people consider, oh my God, how can they exist? They've been doing it for so long, it's part of their business model, it's built into it, it is not an issue for them. Changing in regulations causes huge problems, but they're very good at running within the existing regulation bodies. Next slide. Electricity. This whole project, once started in electricity, trust me, oil and gas companies understand electricity more than you realize because most major refineries have cogen facilities on board. The reason they have cogen facilities is because it takes a lot of energy to process energy. And so since they have things that they can turn into kinetic energy, which then can be turned into electrical energy, why would they pay a local utility for something they can generate themselves? And so as far as most oil and gas major facilities, they have been really built in their own self-sustaining, they own their own ships, they own their own tankers, they own their own pipes, they own their own electric generators, usually gas turbine based. They understand how these things fit together. Next slide. Standards. Way too many to list, but let's look at some of the main drivers. One of their main drivers from I'll call it this grant-specific side, from a security, from how I architect things, how I look at my SCADA things. It was ISA 99, it's now ISA IEC 62443. Even though they built to this standard and they were involved in the building out of this standard, so most of their systems are in some form or fashion compliant to things as this standard series continues to evolve. On the IT side, and these companies have large IT infrastructures, they do play with the NIST 800 series. CFATS gives them a series of standards they have to play with and mess with. The killer, though, is the myriad of stovepipe industry specific. So when they're making their own electricity, they're not subject to NERC SIP because they don't actually do bulk power generation because it's only on their own site, and there's no 15-minute rule for them. However, they have adopted a lot of the industry standard stuff because they have to keep their stuff up and running. The same with gas. The American National Gas Association, ANGAA, they have a whole series of standards. And so where they're moving gas, as in natural gas, things like that, they have to meet, they use that stuff. The same with pipelines, the same with water. By the way, refineries are almost always placed on the water because they use a ton of water in part of the process for cooling. And so although there's no governmental body that says you must comply with these industry-specific stovepipe sets of standards, the workers that do it came from those industries. Those standards developed because they work. And so they ended up in the refineries, in the other places, because they work. Now, to give you a little example on the majors, I'm going to give 3 examples real quick. Shell, Exxon, and we'll take Chevron. Exxon is a company driven 100% by corporate policy procedure. Everything done at Exxon, there is an adopted official policy, an official procedure. This is how it's done. So if there's a really, really good pipeline standard, Exxon will tear it apart, figure it out, and make it their own, and make it their own corporate policy and procedure because they don't follow anybody else's stuff. They only follow their own, although remarkably, when you look at it, it's 100% compliant. So if you like living and working in a world where everything is done by the book, by the company book, and only by the company book, this is your company. If we move to the other side of the world, Shell also believes in doing everything only the Shell way, but they're a little more liberal on the, let's go figure out how best to do it. Let's don't be so rigid, it has to be our way. So Shell changes more. Shell's been driving a lot of security changes in the space. Shell, being a global company, has worked a lot with World Tech and others to drive various initiatives including they're a major driver behind the SANS process of SANS having all sorts of security certs in this area. Chevron sits in the middle. Chevron looks at what ExxonMobil does, they look at what Shell does, and they say, what one can benefit me? And then they they're not as rigid or as lockstep as an Exxon, but they're not as chance-taking as a Shell. And so each company has its own take on all these things. And so you have to learn when you deal with a company how that company really examines things. So even if you walk into an Exxon, it's all going to have Exxon labels on everything, Exxon vocabulary, Exxon this is how they do it, but you're going to be able to recognize these underlying standards once you understand them and can see them. Next slide, please. Protocols. I know in the SCADA slant industrial control space, we have more than enough protocols. When we go look at the oil and gas space, what's interesting is we don't have a single installation. If you walk into a refinery, there may be 200 different what we'll call SCADA circuits involved in a refinery or more, from literally 200 different vendors put in at 200 different times using 200 different protocols. Everything was built the way it was. There is no real standardization. If I go to Exxon, they only use company X, they only use standard Y. Each one of these has been built over decades, and so they use what they got the best bid on when they were putting in that particular line and setting things up. And so when you look at these things, you're going to find that your plant workers are actually fairly proficient in a bunch of these. And you have to pick and choose what works best for each one. Next slide. Almost all of them are still adhering to the old ISA 99 Purdue model system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this model. This should be familiar to everyone. They really do use this all throughout oil and gas. Next slide. So how do we want to think about oil and gas? We have to think of this as a community of collective industries that are working together. That petroleum is their medium, and they're doing certain things with it, but it's bigger than the petroleum. There are all sorts of challenges in their business model everywhere you turn around, and there are a lot of opportunities. They are moving, and they've been moving for a while, but they're big, so it takes a long time to move everything, to a digital world where they want to digitize everything and understand the numbers. A modern refinery can produce a whole lot more than it used to, not because of better chemical processes, but because literally their information is much more up to date, and they produce what they want, where they want, when they want it, at the most efficient times. And that's because of the quote-unquote digital energy movement. And so that's a place where there's a lot of opportunity for resiliency in the things we're looking at. Next slide. But before we get too upset or too excited and want to go someplace, let me tell you what, when you talk to a major oil and gas company, what their main concerns are. Their first concern is safety. Their second concern is safety. Their third concern is safety, and I'm not joking. If you walk in a Chevron office building and you're holding your cell phone, looking at emails while walking, they will stop you and tell you either do your email or walk, don't do both. If you walk up and down stairs in any of these facilities and don't use a handrail, they'll call you on it, everybody. They really do believe in safety. Why? You'll see why when you watch the upcoming movie about the Macondo oil spill. This stuff, when things go wrong, costs them billions of dollars and serious problems. The next thing they're worried about is economic resilience. The 80s almost put some of these big companies out of business. And so everything they look at is, how can I make certain that I can continue to do, no matter what happens externally economically, we can continue to make profit, continue to make money. One of the things you're not going to do is go in and say, well, you're at 4 nines and I can get you to 5 nines. They've already done that. They've already figured that stuff out. They're more interested in what can go wrong, what sort of things are going to interrupt me. So they're looking at stability over efficiency. Next slide. And I think we have 2 minutes left.
Hello, this is Stuart. Let me ask you a quick question. From our interest in cybersecurity and resiliency, if you were asked to identify what is the biggest risk or danger they're facing, what would you say it is?
How to migrate old systems to new standards, how to modernize their facilities without incurring extra costs against an adversary that now is paying attention to them. They have a ton of legacy things that they've had to connect to the internet because they needed to connect it to their enterprise systems, and they cannot afford to just jump in and go replace PLCs, go replace networks, go make huge changes. It's just too big a problem. So what can they do to identify things that will seriously interrupt them?
All right, well, I'd like to thank both of our presenters for giving us a good high-level overview of the 2 primary energy delivery sectors that are of interest to this project. Next week, it will be a couple of presenters from Washington State. We're going to get a little bit closer to some of the core activities of the project, speaking specifically about resilient communications and controls and the cyber issues that come up there. So a hand for Pete and for Art. Yeah, Art, you said something about a movie.
Yeah, the Macondo oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico is going to be a major motion picture probably next spring.
I see, all right.
And you're going to get to see what it looks like when a billion-dollar oil platform blows up.
Is that the movie called The Deep Horizon?
Yes. Deep Horizon was the name of the well sitting on top of Macondo.
I think that's the name of the movie. They're advertising it already, I think.
So.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending. Please, be sure to attend next week. These first 4, we are going to make an effort to record them, but do try to attend, and hopefully we'll get everyone quickly up the learning curve, and so we can start doing great research on the project. Thank you.
Illinois folks, I have a card over here for Sherry. If you haven't had a chance to sign it, will you please? She's out for sinus surgery.